Alright, guys, so about a month ago, I covered the story of the United States as well as many other Western European governments deciding to cut aid to the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the main organization that is tasked with trying to facilitate aid to the roughly 2.3 million starving and bombed out Palestinians inside of Gaza. And at the time, the justification for doing this amid one of the world's worst humanitarian crises was that the Israeli intelligence services alleged that some tiny fraction, a dozen or so, members or employees of the UNRWA in some way, shape, or form had some connections to October 7th. Now, these were unproven, no evidence provided claims at the time, and yet the United States and all these other governments decided to cut that aid. And obviously it was hypocritical just from the jump, because when Israel goes into Gaza and commits widespread human rights abuses and war crimes, and their soldiers are posting them on TikTok for the entire world to see, what does the United States do? Well, we increase the weapon shipments that we are giving to Israel. So it was obviously hypocritical, even if the allegations were true. But now we get this update. Here from the Times of Israel. UNRWA report says Israel coerced some agency employees to falsely admit Hamas links. Now, when they say coerced, that's a fancy word there, a euphemism for tortured. So let's go ahead and read some of the details. They say the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees says that some employees released into Gaza from Israeli detention reported having been pressured by Israeli authorities into falsely stating that the agency has Hamas links and that the staff took part in the October 7th attacks. They say that UNRWA fired 12 staffers earlier this year following allegations from Israel that they actively participated in Hamas's terrorist onslaught. Okay. So, again, just a couple of things here before we get to more of the gruesome aspects of this. Even if the allegations against these 12 staffers out of thousands and thousands that work for UNRWA, even if they were 100% true and 12 staffers from UNRWA went into Israel on October 7th and committed the worst war crimes you could possibly imagine, even if that was true, that still would not justify all of these countries cutting aid in the midst of countless people, literally at this point, starving to death. Okay, it wouldn't justify that. Again, because of the hypocrisy in relation to Israeli war crimes and our continued military and intelligence support to them in the midst of all of that, but also just from a humanitarian perspective, it would not have been justified. But now we get this update. And so a couple of things I want to point out here before we continue. First off, UNRWA was an agency that was created decades and decades and decades ago closer towards the establishment of the State of Israel. And the reason that this organization initially was created was to help, as they point out here, with Palestinian refugees. Now, when they're talking about refugees, in large part, they're talking about some of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were forced through violent means out of their homes during the Nakba, right? And many of the people who live in Gaza right now are either the descendants of, or they themselves directly were expelled from their homes in what we now call Israel and ended up in the Gaza Strip, okay? So part of the reason, I bring that up, because part of the reason that Israel, the Israeli government, hates UNRWA to its core, and you see so many attacks and accusations against the United Nations and against the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is because this agency exists in large part recognizing that many of these Palestinians are refugees, okay, that they were displaced by the creation of the State of Israel. And Israel does not like that. They do not want to have a recognition of the Nakba. They do not want to have a recognition that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their land and ended up in large part in Gaza, for example. So that's part of the reason why you see so many attacks against UNRWA as an organization, right? But again, pressured by Israel to admit false confessions that they had some sort of ties to Hamas. And this has been one of the main attacks that the Israeli government, that supporters of Israel, that politicians in Israel and the United States have been making in order to not only justify cutting off aid to this organization, but also to justify bombing UN refugee centers and shelters and schools inside of Gaza, which they have done repeatedly. And in many instances, either killing UN workers. This has been the deadliest onslaught against UN workers in any war in modern history. and, attacking all of these different UN-related organizations, hiding behind accusations that, no, this isn't the United Nations. These aren't UN workers. They're just Hamas terrorists, right? So they continue. They say the document says that several UNRWA Palestinian staffers had been detained by the Israeli army, and added that the ill treatment and abuse that they had experienced included severe physical beatings, waterboarding, and threats of harm to family members. So in other words, torture. They say, quote, agency staff members have been subjected to threats and coercion by the Israeli authorities while in detention and pressured to make false statements against the agency, including that the agency has affiliations with Hamas and that UNRWA staff members took part in the October 7th, 2023 atrocities. So even the allegations against 12 out of 13,000 UNRWA employees inside of Gaza, even those allegations, highly questionable. Not only even before this report about torture and coerced confessions came out, there were already completely dubious claims that were being made. But now with this added aspect to it, of course, even Western governments have to question, okay, were these accusations against these 12 UNRWA employees, were those just fabricated because the people who made those statements were tortured and forced to, be coerced into giving false statements? And keep in mind, guys, the United States of America still has not resumed aid to this organization. I mean, this is where we're at right now. They finish off here saying, in addition to the alleged abuse endured by UNRWA staff members, Palestinian detainees more broadly described allegations of abuse, including beatings, humiliation, threats, dog attacks, sexual violence, and deaths of detainees denied medical treatment, the UNRWA report says. So, in other words, this is not anything unique to this one situation with these specific UN staffers who were released. This is part and parcel of the normal operating procedure for the IDF, for the Israeli government, when it comes to not just UN staff, but any Palestinians who they take into their possession, who they are detaining, right? And this is an important time to recognize, right? Because when we have these conversations about hostage swaps, right, or some sort of a deal to release the hostages from Gaza back to Israel, and in exchange, Israel would release Palestinian prisoners, many Americans, from what I've seen at least, seem to think that the prisoners who are being released as a part of these deals are all just like violent terrorists or something who have been, given due process and they're convicted by legitimate civil courts, and then, they're prosecuted based on evidence. That's not largely what happens, okay? Largely what happens is that many of these Palestinians who are detained go through military courts where the conviction rate is like 99.9%, okay? Many of the detainees could be just like some kid who was holding a rock, okay? Or threw a rock at an IDF soldier who was invading the West Bank. So these are hostages that are being held by Israel in the same exact way that you would characterize the hostages that are being held by Hamas inside of Gaza. And so that's the framing that if you're going to have an honest conversation about this, needs to be had. You can't talk about, well, Hamas needs to release the hostages unilaterally, but Israel doesn't, because these are somehow legitimate prisoners. Again, largely, they're not legitimate prisoners. Many of them are held in what's called administrative detention, where they're held indefinitely with nothing even remotely resembling due process, and they are kept over and over and over again, extending this administrative detention through these military courts. So these are hostages in an equal sense as Hamas is holding hostages inside of Gaza. And so again, the question is like, the United States cuts this aid, these other Western governments cut this aid, with no legitimate justification or reason or evidence to believe that these were valid allegations in the first place. I mean, this was from March 1st, so it was about 10 days ago. I haven't seen any updates since then that Israel has provided any verifiable evidence that UNRWA employees, committed atrocities on October 7th. Again, even if they had, that still wouldn't justify cutting aid to an organization that is facilitating aid to a massive starving population right now. But, I mean, again, Israel yet to provide evidence to back the UNRWA October 7th attack claims, according to the United Nations. So, the US and all these other countries, they just cut the aid without any evidence provided. Immediately, they cut the aid. Now we're at the point where some of these other governments that participated in that have resumed funding to UNRWA. So here we have him, Kenneth Roth, the former, head of Human Rights Watch. He says Sweden, Canada, and the European Union have now all resumed funding for UNRWA, refusing to pursue Israel's vendetta against Palestinian refugees at the expense of starving Palestinians in Gaza, but not Biden. So now even all these other governments, okay, the European Union, Canada, Sweden, they have all resumed funding to UNRWA. Probably because they recognized either, number one, regardless of the allegations, the humanitarian situation is as dire as you could possibly imagine, and therefore the need for funding for an organization like UNRWA trumps any sort of allegations that they participated in, the October 7th attacks with 12 of their members or something like that. But number two, I mean, for the Biden administration to see all of these other governments resuming aid and to still deny aid to UNRWA, as they're also going around and parading these ideas of we're going to build a floating port on the coast of Gaza, and maybe it'll be up and running in 2 months from now, possibly, and we're also going to continue these airdrops that are a tiny, minuscule fraction of the aid that's needed, and oopsie daisy, accidentally killed 5 Palestinians as a part of one of these drops. Like, the idea that that is a coherent strategy for delivering aid. Earlier today, I covered an interview with Biden. Emphasizing the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We got to get more aid in there. Meanwhile, you're still cutting aid to UNRWA. Make that make sense. The Biden administration cannot possibly come out and try to make the claim that they are doing, we're doing everything we can to get more aid to the Palestinians. We care about the humanitarian crisis. You cannot say that while you're still doing this. It's a direct contradiction. You cannot make that make sense. And so, again, as I pointed out in that Times of Israel article, this isn't the only example that we've seen of this. This was a video that I covered a while back now. It was recently reposted, but, this was something from, at this point, maybe a couple months ago. But here we see the IDF, who is basically, kidnapped, whatever you want to say, largely Gazan civilians here. And you're going to get a sense of exactly how they view, every single Palestinian civilian in Gaza, right? If they deny that they have any connections to Hamas, if they deny that they had any, October 7th attack, affiliations or anything like that, they basically just keep them in positions like this or torture them until they just, give a false confession and admit that they have some sort of a Hamas tie. So let's watch this video again.
ايش مخبلين؟ ارفع راسك شوي. مصطفى من وين انت؟ انا سهيل. بني سهيلة؟ انت ب 7 اكتوبر وين كنت؟ ما تكذب بس. والله عند تاع الكنب. الكنب؟ لكن ليش انت هون هيك؟ فكر يعني احنا بناخذ ناس كيف ما بدنا؟ والله خلاني بشتغل במחלת הכנב. כולם מתחילים ככה ואחרי זה אתה יודע כולם מספרים את האמת אבל זה מחבל של חמאס.
Okay, so again, I work at a furniture store, and he's just like, yeah, see, this is where they start. They start out claiming that they work at some, furniture store, and then after a while, after we keep them in these positions, blindfolded in these, like, white suits that we're putting them in, I've seen other situations where they literally are writing numbers on people's arms with no historical irony whatsoever, keeping them in these positions, potentially torturing them off camera. And then he's like, eventually they'll admit that they're part of Hamas. Yeah, if you torture people, then eventually they're going to tell you whatever you want to hear. That's how torture works. That's why we decided a long time ago, or at least most of us decided, that torture is not a reliable method to getting information, accurate information at least. If you're trying to fit a narrative, then maybe torture is viable for the government of Israel, right? Now, a couple other things that I wanted to show you guys. Here was, some recent footage that came out of Khan Yunis. And I made this point on Twitter. I think a lot of people disagreed with me. Let me know what you guys think. But I look at images like this, and I find it genuinely hard to believe that there is a massive chunk of the American people who are willing to look at images like this, of this level of destruction, and come away with the conclusion that this is some sort of a targeted operation against Hamas. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a huge chunk of the American people who can look at images like this and think, yeah, that's all Hamas's fault, right? Israel has no agency. The United States has no complicity. This is all because they're evil terrorists. I don't know what narrative that people use to justify this in their heads, but I do I guess maybe I have a good heart. Maybe I'm too, too understanding of many people's perspectives. But I do genuinely think that there is a large chunk of the American people that just, because they're in an echo chamber, because maybe they only watch mainstream media, that they have not been exposed to images like this. Because again, I struggle to believe that a human being can look at shit like this, can look at the endless images and videos that we've seen of completely innocent children who have been killed, maimed, dismembered, whatever you want to call it, and come away with the conclusion that this is somehow a targeted operation against Hamas. You can look at overhead images. This is one from Al Jazeera here, where they show the level of destruction. I mean, some people may be able to justify this internally. I don't know how you can look at overhead images where, as far as the eye can see, it is just destroyed buildings left and right, and think that this is justifiable. It is not justifiable. I mean, how many churches, how many mosques, how many residential buildings, how many healthcare facilities, how many schools, how many refugee camps, how many UN shelters have been attacked in just 5 short months, as long as they've felt? And so, I think that this does point to, in a large way, the importance of independent outlets, right? Because I know people who watch my channel, people who follow me on Twitter, people who are leftists, whatever, they follow other leftist channels, you watch Kyle, you watch whoever. I know that people who watch my channel and other ones like it, that you guys get a perspective, a daily perspective, on what is actually happening on the ground. But I don't think that that's what most Americans are getting. And I think they get a warped perspective, a filtered perspective on what Israel is doing. It's very easy for pundits on CNN or MSNBC to sit back and to say, oh, it sucks that so many civilians have been killed, but it's a war and yada, yada, yada. What are you going to do about it? When you see shit like this, I mean, listen, Hamas, whether or not you like him or not, I don't. Hamas does not have an air force. Gaza doesn't even have a functioning airport, for that matter. Hamas does not have air defense. Hamas, compared to Israel's military apparatus, backed by the most powerful and wealthy country in the history of the world, with the most powerful military apparatus in the history of the world, the United States of America, this is not a comparable thing here, guys. This is not a war. It's a slaughter. It is an endless destruction of civilian life and civilian infrastructure, literally as far as the eye can see. And so people need to be more aware of images like this, right? How do you justify this? We'll finish off with this because I think this perfectly encapsulates what I'm trying to say here. I mean, this was a picture that was going viral. It's a picture of U.S. or, allied countries with the U.S. who have been doing some of these aid airdrops into Gaza. And then in the foreground, you can see the smoke billowing from a recent Israeli airstrike. This is Joe Biden's policy. This is Joe Biden's policy. We are going to drop 10 times the amount of bombs as we are loaves of bread. That's what we're seeing at play here. The Joe Biden administration, I covered earlier today, no red lines for the Israeli government ahead of their Rafah invasion, which is going to create somehow an even worse humanitarian crisis on the ground. This is the Biden policy. We're going to continue to send endless shipments of weapons and supplies to Israel to continue their genocidal war on Gaza. But don't worry, guys. We're the moral actors here because we're dropping crumbs from the sky, right? We're going to drop 10 bombs on your head, and then we're going to throw a loaf of bread at you and pretend as if that makes us humanitarian. Pretend as if that gives us the moral high ground. It doesn't. It doesn't. And Joe Biden is just as complicit in this as anybody could possibly be. And so the idea at this point that we're getting credible allegations from the United Nations that UNRWA staff were tortured by Israel into false confessions against the agency about some supposed Hamas links, and that the Biden administration is still withholding aid from UNRWA, even as other Western governments around the world have seemingly called bullshit and have resumed funding. I mean, what do you even say at this point? If anybody genuinely believes that the Biden administration cares about the humanitarian crisis on the ground that's being caused by the United States and Israel, that he cares about it, or that he's doing everything in his power to get a real lasting ceasefire, or that he's doing everything in his power to get humanitarian aid to the starving people of Gaza. If you genuinely believe that narrative, I don't know what else to show you. Because his policies, his actual actions say otherwise.